Hi there, I'm Annette Laing. I write a non-boring history on Substack, and I'm delighted to have with me today Clare Mulley, all the way from the UK. Hi, Clare. Clare is an award-winning, best-selling author, and you don't always hear those two things in the same sentence, writing meticulously researched historical biographies. Among her books is The Spy Who Loved, which is about Christina Skarbek, otherwise known as Christine Granville, a Polish noblewoman who was reputedly Churchill's favorite spy during World War II and who really outbonded James Bond. She's also written The Women Who Flew for Hitler, about two women who, just as the title suggested, flew during World War II for the Nazis, but ended up having two very different stances on the war itself. Clare is also a book reviewer for various august publications in the United Kingdom, including The Spectator, The Telegraph, and History Today. She's also familiar to British viewers for her frequent appearances on television, including in BBC's Rise of the Nazis, Channel 5's Secret History of World War II, and Adolf and Eva, among many, many others. All of her books so far are optioned for television and movies, which means, as far as I'm concerned, it's only a matter of time and they need to really, really hurry up. These are all books with incredible popular appeal that also complicate our understanding of her subjects. But the book I'm going to discuss with Clare today is her very first, and on quite a different subject. It is The Woman Who, hey, I'll beat you to it, I have a different cover. The Woman Who Saved the Children, and this is the story, a biography of Eglantyne Jebb, who, as the title suggests, founded the charity Save the Children. Clare, by the way, holds a master's degree from the University of London in social and cultural history, but unlike most of the authors that I write about and talk about at Non-Boring History, Clare wisely did not go into academia, which gives her a really terrific opportunity to connect with the public in very, very thoughtful ways. So welcome, Clare. Thank you for taking the time from your very busy schedule. I do appreciate it.
Thank you for having me on.
Certainly. And Eglantyne Jebb, founder of Save the Children, upper-class Victorian woman, very much a woman of her times. And she founds this charity, and yet she's very blunt about it. She didn't like children. You, a very modern person and the mother of three, what led you to write about her?
Yeah, I love this seeming contradiction. I don't think it actually is a contradiction, but it is true that she'd been a teacher early on in her career, and she really found children very stressful, exhausting, too loud, noisy. And yeah, I've got three now.
Fair enough.
So I know
yeah,
where she's coming from.
Enough. Yeah.
But she kind of respected them, perhaps as adults. I think back in the day, you said she was a woman of her times. I think perhaps she was ahead of her times in many ways. So she saw children as human beings. And she certainly wrote that she didn't want to spend, I think she said the idea of closer acquaintance it appalled her. And it was a dreadful idea. So she didn't beat her bones about it. In fact, in the year she set up Save the Children, she told her best mate, a very close friend, Margaret Keynes, that she said, it's appalling. I have to give all these talks about Save the Children and, the common love of humanity towards children. It disgusts me, yuck, So she really didn't particularly want to spend time around children. She wasn't particularly maternal herself. She didn't have any children of her own. She never, in fact, married. There could be a number of reasons for that, but I do think she respected children. So what she saw was young adults, or she saw people, and she actually went on, at a time when most people didn't think that children actually were humans enough to have human rights. Human rights were only for people of the age of 18, and below that, people, there were parental rights, and the state had the right over children as well, but children didn't have individual rights. So one of the things that she did was she pioneered the idea of children being human beings and being party to human rights.
And I noticed she laid the groundwork for the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of the Child. Yeah, and
so there's a wonderful story about that. It was apparently a sunny summer Sunday. She climbed up, 1924, she climbed up Mont Salève. Excuse me. And in fact, I went out to Mont Salève. I was actually pregnant at the time doing my research for this, and I went out and I thought, well, I'll climb up as well. But I thought it would be, because this was my third child, so I'd had two, and I'd been watching a lot of The Sound of Music, and I thought these mountains might be, you know, hills with daisies in the fields. But no, it's sheer vertical rock. For thousands of feet, you know, it's incredible. And then I saw there was a beautiful old, is how I went up, in one of those sort of like a ski lift that takes you up to the top. And it had black and white photographs in it of ladies in cloches, but it turned out that it had only been put in place a couple of years after Eglantyne died. So she actually did go in her long skirts and tightly laced boots and climb up this mountain. And she would settle down on the crisp turf at the top and look down over Geneva, which of course is the international city. It's where the lake of Geneva at that point was full of barges with building materials to build what is now the United Nations building, which was then the League of Nations being built. It's where Esperanto was formed, and the International Women's League was there. So she settled down and cracked a square of chocolate, because one of the things I do, you know, many things I take from her is my love of chocolate. And she looked down over this view, and she was inspired to come up with this idea that every child everywhere in the world should be party to the same universal human rights. And she penned a statement. It was just five things, you know, very quite basic initially, about healthcare, food, education, a safe space to play, all those sorts of things. I marched down the mountain and got it pushed through the United Nations, or the League of Nations as it was then. She was actually the first advisor for women and healthcare to the League of Nations.
And she's a very practical person. And one of the things that came out in the book is that it is experience that pushes her to work for children as opposed to with them. And what were the pivotal experiences or influences that do you think drew her into this work?
Well, she had already, I mean, she'd had a role in teaching. I mean, you can go, I don't want to get cod psychology, you can go back to her childhood and the death of her younger brother, which affected her very deeply. And she refers to him a lot later on in her life. And I think he's this sort of representative of the value, the potential of youth and the value of life, and of a commitment she took at that point to live a life of social purpose. And she was inspired by her parents. Her mother set up a national organisation in the creative industries to give people artisanal skills and so on. So she had a wonderful example of a compassionate idea being turned into a national movement through her mother's work. And so she had a lot of these inspirational ideas. She was one of the sort of second generation of women in Britain to get a university education. She went to Lady Margaret Hall in Oxford, which now has a bronze bust of her in their library. And so there are a number of inspirations, but of course it was the First World War. I mean, just before the war, she went out for her brother-in-law. She was very close to her sister Dorothy, and she had married a Liberal MP, a Quaker, and he went out to the Balkans and saw what was really, we now know, the rumblings towards the First World War, but then it was sort of seen as a civil conflict in that part of Europe. And he sent her out because she'd already done good work in charities in Cambridge, but she'd never really considered doing international development work or help. So she went out and set up soup kitchens and, you know, family tracing and things like that. And she kind of realized then that this is really important work, but it's ambulance work, relief work, and what you need to do is try and stop some of this from happening. So she's taking a very progressive view even very early on. And then she came back, and her work is completely swept aside by the First World War, which is, you know, very depressing. But she takes an active role translating the press with her sister Dorothy, and then eventually, at the end of the war, she's really appalled because the British, then Liberal government, decided to continue the economic blockade against Europe as a means of pushing through harsh peace terms, or really to get better reparations for Britain. And Eglantyne felt if people knew the human cost of that policy, they'd be as appalled as she was, because at this point there were about 800 children dying in Germany every week. And
well, it's interesting that she had this sort of early grasp of the power of propaganda, so that yes, during the First World War, she and Dorothy and others were, Dorothy's husband, were working to translate the foreign press article
Yes.
showing a very different perspective on World War One, which it really sort of walked a fine line, didn't it, in terms of legality, because the British government had imposed strict censorship. But, you know, they're shining a light that maybe the news you're getting isn't the news. And then after the war, when she was arrested for distributing pamphlets.
Well, exactly. She had this wonderful leaflet that she'd become part of the Fight the Famine Council to try and change that legislation. That was getting nowhere fast. So she just on her own, you said she was practical. She gets up and produced this leaflet with a very upsetting photograph of looks like a little baby, can't stand, massive head, tiny body. But it's actually a 2.5-year-old girl who's suffering from malnutrition and whose body hasn't developed sufficiently because the nutrients are needed for the brain. And she started taking that around, distributing it mainly in Trafalgar Square, which is sort of traditional site of public protest in the centre of London, where the suffragettes often were. And she was using suffragette tactics. She'd learned that, so she was chalking up the pavement, saying, "Fight the famine, end the blockade." And she was, of course, arrested pretty much immediately. Well, she managed to get rid of 800 leaflets, but she was arrested and taken away. But they made a bit of a mistake because she's not the sort of person that you can quietly sweep under a carpet. So when her court case came up, she actually insisted on presenting her own defence. And she knew that legally she didn't have a leg to stand on because her leaflets weren't cleared by the government censors. So she focused on the moral argument, and she gave the court reporters up in the gallery at the courthouse plenty to fill their columns with. And the Crown Prosecutor, Sir Archibald Bodkin, he didn't spare her in his condemnation. But once the case was closed, and she was only fined £5, and it could have been £5 for every leaflet, or she could have been given a prison sentence, you know, so it really was the minimum. Once the case was over, he came up to her in front of everyone, including the reporters, and took out of his wallet a £5 note. You know, they were quite big in those days, so you had to unfold this note, and pressed it into her hands. You know, it's the sum of her fine. He's clearly saying, as far as I'm concerned, you know, morally, you've won your case. And she said, "No, thanks. I can pay my own fine." But she took his £5. She said, "I'll put this towards a new cause to help save the children of Europe." And that was the first donation ever to save the children from the Crown Prosecutor at the founder's arrest. So
lovely story. And you know what you said earlier, that she was a woman ahead of her time. Yes. I do think you bring that out in the book. That Save the Children rapidly becomes not just a sort of a local little charity in London coming out of, you know, this one little group, but she meets the Pope. There are branches of Save the Children all over the world in pretty short order.
Meeting the Pope, she actually wrote first to the head of the Church of England, who was Archbishop Randall at the time, and because her faith, she was a Christian, her faith was kind of unique and spiritual, but it was within the Christian fold in her mind. And so she wrote to the head of the Church of England, Archbishop of Canterbury, for support. And he thought, well, actually, this is quite political. Wasn't she arrested? You know, didn't even bother writing back. So she just wrote to the other one. And the Pope was much more interested and invited her to meet him. So she went over to the Vatican. She had to wear a mantilla over her face. And then apparently the door burst open and an emissary called out in Italian, and she spoke many languages, but sadly not Italian, but he kind of turned and ran on his heels. She said he looked like an Indian rubber ball in a purple dressing gown, kind of bounding down this corridor. And she was nothing for it. She had to kind of hold on to her mantilla and pull up her skirt and peg after him. And she went into this big hall that was full of gold and, you know, big pillars. And there, she said, was a little figure at the back, standing still like a ghost. And suddenly remembering, you know, popes tend to wear white, look a bit ghostly. She bobbed down on one knee, and it was the Pope, and he came and raised her up. And instead of the 20-minute appointment, he gave her over 2 hours, making notes in what she called a grubby little notebook. And he was so, you know, inspired by her. I mean, she commissioned some very early research, but her passion as well, her knowledge, that he said, yeah, I won't just ask Catholic churches in England, as she'd requested, to give their collections one day for Save the Children's cause, but I'll ask Catholic churches around the world. And because of that, these individual congregations overseas then said, well, the need hasn't gone away, and they became the early Save the Children's overseas. So you have this very interesting and very modern organisation that not only raises funds in Britain and sends it overseas, but raises funds all over the world and sends it wherever it's needed. And reciprocity like that is at the heart of what she believed. So, for example, one of the first donors to the children of Vienna after the First World War, when the mining unions in Wales came together and all their members put some money in to help these children who were starving to death in Austria and Vienna. And then about 4 or 5 years later, there were terrible poverty in the Welsh valleys because there were miners' strikes and a collapse of the industry. And there was real suffering among the children, and the city of Vienna got together and raised funds and sent aid and funding support back over to Wales. And that's how it's always been. It's not about what we now call the developed world or the Western Hemisphere or the North helping the South or whatever. It's about wherever there is need and wherever there is opportunity to help. It's reciprocal.
Right. She had a very, in that way, a very modern perspective, very egalitarian perspective. And yeah. And yeah, and at the same time, when I think of her as, here's this woman with this incredible upper middle class confidence that is sort of developed, particularly, I imagine, at Oxford. And so, in that sense, a Victorian woman and such a short life, dies at 52. Is there a place, the world of non-profits, as we say in the US, or charities today, is a very different place from in Eglantyne Jebb's time. Would there be a place for an Eglantyne Jebb in the world of non-profits or charities today?
Oh, there are some, and we need more. There's no question of it. Yeah, I mean, and she was very ahead of her time. It wasn't just that. I mean, she was the first person to use cinema photography, cinema footage to really bring home to people what was going on. She used, skip lunch for the first time, donate your lunch money. All of these things. Sponsor a Child was part of that initial team. So in fundraising, use of branding, it's absolutely fantastic. You see her wearing Save the Children hats. I've looked everywhere in people's attics for that hat. If you come across it, Annette, please let me know.
I will.
So, she's using all this very modern ways, and her language, her way of talking about it, it's not patronizing, it's very modern. So yes, of course, we need much more people, working along those lines. And there's other things that she brings as well. So, her closest relationship in life was with a woman. And for a long time, this wasn't just talked about because people were worried, about that, the sensitivities around that. I mean, thank goodness, a lot of the world has moved on now. And this is something discussed much more openly. And in fact, Save the Children does a huge amount of work around LGBTQ plus issues, which is fantastic. So how wonderful to have a woman like that who was pioneering the way back in the day.
Fantastic. And you did yourself work for Save the Children when you began this project, and which brought you into contact, if not literally, with Eglantyne Jebb. And all the royalties, I believe, from this book go to Save the Children, which is fabulous and marvellous. So from your first project then to your most recent, you're writing a book, I believe, already under contract with Weidenfeld and Nicholson, called Agent Zoe. Can you give us a little bit of an idea a little preview of what that's going to be about?
Lovely question, thank you. Agent Zoe is the working title. I hope it will be called that, we'll see. It's about this incredible woman. She's in the Second World War. She's basically a special agent in the Second World War. And she was the only Polish woman to manage to bring contact between the commander-in-chief in occupied Poland, the first of the occupied countries. She gets through Germany, over the Pyrenees, through France, over the Pyrenees. This absolutely extraordinary journey, and being shot at in the mountains, all the rest of it, and eventually reached London, where she reported to the Polish commander-in-chief, President Sikorski, and had to go through working with SOE and all the rest of it. And then she's there, and the Poles are just like amazed that a woman has achieved this. It's, some of them say, we can't even kiss your hand. You're a goddess to us. I mean, how did you manage it? You're so wonderful. And she's just like, oh, stop all that. Where are the files? Why aren't you answering the ciphers quickly enough? And she tries to improve all their systems, and they can't stand it because she's a woman. So one of them tries flirting with her. He thinks, well, maybe, if I talk about silk stockings, that will, get the feminine side out. She's just like, oh, come on. So she's just sort of given all these extra hurdles. And in the end, they say, okay, thanks. We've got all the information. She brings this incredible stash of information about persecution of the Jews, about some of the V1 missiles, the Vengeance, that's the buzz bomb, all the troop movements, everything. They say, okay, thank you. That's been fantastic. So now, where do you want to relax? You want to spend the rest of the war in Scotland? She's like, don't be ridiculous. I'm going back to Poland. And they're like, well, how? You can't parachute. And she said, well, why not? The men are parachuting. So she becomes the only female member of the Polish Special Forces paratroopers, the Cichociemni, or silent and unseen, to parachute back behind enemy lines into Warsaw, and then fights in the Warsaw Uprising. And that's not the end of her story. I mean, she's just this amazing, amazing woman.
But, I detect this theme in your books, in being drawn to these to these exceptional, extraordinary women, and maybe not exceptional. I mean, that's the other thing. I often talk to teachers, and one of the things I tried everybody about is, don't assume you know everything about a subject. Just don't. You never will. And much of it still remains to be written. Most of it still remains to be written. There are just so many stories. And right now, and this is just my own personal comment that you need not endorse, you know, I've just seen a very concerning kind of uptick in misogyny in the last couple of years. This thing about Karens that I find very, very strange. It is so good to see you complicating people's understanding of women's role in the past. And
grey area.
Yeah, well, and it's, you're dealing with stories that academic historians, and I think it's fair to say in Britain particularly, it's a more conservative field. They're going to attack me for this, but it is a more narrow field, and you've been able not only to do work that they haven't, but also to bring it to this enormous audience. So for that, thank you so much. Clare Mulley, once again, folks, you can get this and any of Clare's wonderful books from the source of your choice. And of course, I always do encourage folks to, you know, avoid the dreaded Amazon, and, you know, if you can. But either way, do get a hold of them. Don't forget libraries and independent bookstores. Clare, it's been an absolute pleasure having you today. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Annette,
for your time.
It was a pleasure.